Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site is Molly Wood, founder of MollyWood Media, Jay co-founder and managing director of the Lightsmith Group, and founder and chair of GARI, which is the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group, as well as Abhishek Singh, co-founder and CEO of AiDash. We're here to discuss the unavoidable opportunity, which is the massive investment opportunity in climate adaptation and resilience solutions. It is great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. And Molly, if it's any indication how this is a massive opportunity, it's what we're seeing here in New York City Climate Week. What is everyone doing here?
So everyone is convening for a variety of reasons. They're talking about policy, they're talking about investment. I would say increasingly over the years it's become an investment conversation, and they're talking about the progress that we have and have not made in addressing the climate crisis. And we will talk about this more, but that's a big part of the reason that this year in particular, adaptation and resilience is top of mind for a lot of people.
And so Jay, tell us about the work that you're doing at the Lightsmith Group and why you're zoning in on this particular investment arena.
It's great to be here. Lightsmith Group is a global private equity firm that runs the first private investment fund focused on adaptation and climate resilience. And so we think, as we've been talking about in other conversations, that this is an unavoidable opportunity. What we mean by that is the scientists have now made clear that we're in for, unfortunately, a minimum of 1.5 degrees of global warming. We're getting close to that right now. And if you look at their graphics in the last report they released last year, the amount of climate change between now and 2030 is basically baked in. There's a limited amount of change between now and 2040, but the next 5 to 15 years, the direction of climate change is pretty clear. And so I would actually argue that for most investors, you should think about the fact that you have more conviction that climate change will continue to happen. You have more certainty about that than the direction of interest rates, inflation, consumer behavior, artificial intelligence, who Taylor Swift will be dating in 5 years. Right. And so as a result of that, we should bake that into our understanding of how we're making investments. So that creates this enormous challenge for the world, but also an opportunity for technologies and solutions to meet that challenge, which is definitely going to be increasing.
And let's talk about those technologies for a moment here, Abhishek, and what AiDash is doing, because part of this climate change narrative is the demand for energy to drive these emerging technologies.
Absolutely. The grid capacity has to increase by 3 times in the next few years to support the energy transition. For that to happen, the power line, the grid has to be inspected every year, and US has 7 million miles of power line. It's impossible to humanly achieve that. That is where AiDash came in picture. We use satellite and AI to monitor the grid at scale and help these industry, the utility industry, become climate resilient and sustainable.
Is there enough energy to satisfy this demand, or do we need to bring more resources online?
The energy needs to be created. That's what the generation is all about. But the even bigger problem is distribution. The grid is choking today. There are not enough manpower or labor to inspect that. That is where companies like AiDash are helping in inspecting those assets at scale continuously.
And Molly, I love getting perspective from other veterans in the media space, such as yourself. How does adaptation and resilience as a subset of climate investing, how did that get on your radar, and how do you interpret that market?
Yeah, I was lucky or unlucky enough to have had a conversation with a world-renowned climate scientist that I share a hairdresser with 9 or 10 years ago, who said to me effectively what Jay just said, that there is some amount of warming that is baked in, and that in order to deal with that, it would be an engineering problem on some level, which sort of, led my practical brain to go, okay, well, who's working on this? Who is making sure that the technologies exist, that the future innovations exist to make parts of the planet more habitable, but also harden them against the risk of increasingly extreme weather? And that genuinely is how I went from a tech and business reporter to a climate tech reporter, asking that pretty fundamental question. It got a lot broader from there. But the urgency has unfortunately only increased.
I mean, Jay, and it makes sense in terms of why Molly sees the opportunity here, because these are capital intensive projects. They're big projects, as you know from your public policy background. It takes time to get these approved for a number of reasons. So tell us about the work that you're doing with GARI to identify these resilience markets, these companies that could be the leaders within this space.
Yeah, so the GARI working group published a paper earlier this year called The Unavoidable Opportunity, which makes the growth investment case for investments in adaptation and climate resilience technologies like AiDash. And so we start with the science and said, look, there's a whole bunch of different specific impacts that are going to happen that are projected by the scientists over the next 5 to 15 years in water, in agriculture, in the supply chain, in our energy systems, in transportation, in coastal region. We're seeing that impact right now. So, last May there were orange skies over New York City. My children couldn't go to school because the air quality was so bad as a result of wildfires in Canada, thousands of miles away. And so that led to a surge in, I think, Amazon orders for air purifiers. We bought some. And that kind of thinking where you link the impact and risk to the opportunity, where there's technologies that can help you understand how that's going to change and manage that risk, is where we should be focusing our efforts. So the GARI working group published that paper analyzing this together with the MSCI Sustainability Institute, Bezos Earth Fund, Lightsmith itself, and others to really focus on what companies are out there right now that have these technologies that may not be describing them in New York Climate Week terms as adaptation or climate resilience, but are the tools that we're going to absolutely need in scale. That means more demand. That's currently not understood by many investors or many companies. That's alpha for investors that will inevitably, unavoidably increase over the next 5 to 15 years.
So let's talk about AiDash for a moment here and why it's critical for the world to invest in these type of companies. I would imagine a lot of this comes back to data, being able to quantify these decisions.
Right. So, for example, US has 7 million miles of power lines. That means almost a 250 million poles. That means billions of trees. These need to be inspected every year. And add all the weather and climate impact, the storms and wildfire risk which are happening. The data is terabytes of data which needs to be inspected, analyzed. That is where the technology like AI can be used to inspect, to analyze and predict potential risks which utilities can act before it causes a wildfire or a power outage.
Yeah, well, it's also a matter of it being good data coming out and structured, and something that these companies can use to identify which assets require that investment, or what areas are vulnerable, and to help them make better decisions, which, by the way, longer term, you want them to be sustainable and not just a near-term Band-Aid.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where, for example, the data also includes which of my feeders are supporting or empowering hospitals, senior living, etc., so that a higher priority can be given to restoration of those sections of lines during a storm. So that's where the holistic solution and analysis of predicting, planning, and prioritizing the maintenance is done.
Mm-hmm. And Molly, let's pull the curtain back here for a moment. What are you doing across Climate Week?
Well, I was actually going to say, I think prediction is such a huge part of that, because when we talk about adaptation, a key component here and what makes companies investable in this space is it's the companies who are not thinking about the situation that we lived in even this year. They're the ones who are saying, this is the situation we will live in 5 years or 10 years or 12 years, and using technology to predict that, but also having that mindset. It's those companies that may not identify as adaptation and resilience companies, but who are thinking ahead to a reality that's different from the one we live in today.
That's a great point that you bring up too, because you and I, when we report on companies that are adapting emerging technologies such as AI, machine learning, other predictive technologies, you can't just attach it to the name because that's what investors want to hear. You have to have a problem that you're looking to solve. Otherwise, it's a waste of investing in the tech stack, which is a common problem with some companies.
Absolutely, and it's companies who, I think what's so interesting about this paper, and you should give some more of these examples, is that they've identified companies you would never think of. My favorite example coming out of it is Kohler, a company that makes faucets and sinks, and everybody knows them for that, but they sell a lot of generators. And that makes them an adaptation and resilience investment, because power is less reliable, not for long, thanks to AiDash, but in a lot of places because of extreme weather.
And that's another great point that you bring up, because, Jay, when I think about alternative energy and procuring these sources, I don't think it's one solution is going to fit, the energy demand, right? That it's going to be a portfolio of energy solutions.
Absolutely, and that energy set of solutions, like all the solutions, are going to be in a much more complicated world going forward, right? So companies need to think about investing not to replace, but investing to evolve, right? So the complexity of everything is just going to increase as a result of climate change, technology, a range of other things. The only way to manage that complexity is to use data, to use analytics, to use new technologies, new services to do that. We're about to deploy $1 trillion of infrastructure in the United States. That's more money than we spent on infrastructure since we built the interstate highway system. That infrastructure needs to be infrastructure for the next 50 and 100 years, not the last 50 and 100 years. So it needs technology to be embedded in it, it needs to have analysis brought to it, and it needs to be adapted or evolved for the future that we're going to see.
Yeah, and hopefully it's being allocated to the appropriate places and that there will be some sense of transparency and accountability to that. I think that is a risk that can sometimes happen with public investment, and we're not quite sure where things are going. So do you see it being a matter of public-private relationships that will help to execute on this?
Absolutely, and also there's, I mean, we're talking about the investor case for adaptation and climate resilience. Make no mistake, climate change is a humanitarian tragedy, and we're seeing it unfold in many places, in many communities around the world right now. There is demand created from that for technologies, for investments. I think I'm a technological optimist. I think that's how we manage this incredibly complicated problem we've created for ourselves. But there needs to also be a real focus, as you've seen here in New York Climate Week, on equity, on communities that are being left behind, on developing countries. That's what a lot of the policy discussion is. And I think, again, technology can play a role. AiDash operates in the United States and Europe and other places. We're going to try and help bring that technology to Brazil, to South Africa, to other countries, if we are going to accomplish the energy transition to a climate change, climate mitigated universe that also needs to be resilient to the effects of climate change. That's the path forward.
Yeah, and Molly, I would imagine you have the same mindset as well when you're thinking about reporting on this. It's a circular thing. These are good paying jobs. It reskills the workforce. And what happens to that, right? It goes back into the economy. It educates for the next 40, 50, 60 years in a different way. And I think, you know, when you approach policymakers or local governments, municipalities and so forth, that's the way to tell the story. Because I think we've gotten over the, you know, AI is taking our jobs and all that. Okay, fine, we know AI is here. How do we reskill it and bring it back into the economy?
Right, and we have already seen massive American economic growth related to investments that were catalyzed by the Inflation Reduction Act. We will continue to see more. These are sustainable jobs in the climate sense. They are also sustainable jobs in that they are going to need to exist for a long time going forward. That this is, in fact, I mean, I believe firmly that we are in the climate economy. There's just nothing that won't be touched by this.
I think it's a strategic competitive advantage. I mean, like, if you can have the technologies for the future that we're going to see, which is more complex, climate resilience and adaptation, companies that do it will gain market share, will gain customers. If I can deliver your 2-day Amazon packages despite a freeze in Texas or fires in California, I will be more competitive. The United States will be more competitive. We build those technologies and export them to the rest of the world. There is a, you know, there should be a call for like a CHIPS Act for adaptation and climate resilience technologies, where we build the capabilities to face the future that we're going to see, because that is an unavoidable future at this point. Not that being said, I think that there's entrepreneurs out there, innovators, investors. We know that this is coming. If we're having this conversation 5 years from now, the one thing I know is that climate will have changed. And the question is, what do we do with the opportunity to know that's going to happen now as investors, as policymakers, as citizens? What investments are we making? What choices are we making? What are we doing with the unavoidable opportunity?
I want to go back to that in a moment, but speaking of companies and what they're looking to achieve, Abhishek, explain to us what AiDash is seeking to accomplish this week at Climate Week.
So at this Climate Week, we are meeting investors. Multiple entities are required to fix the problem. It's a huge problem. The investor community, the government, the industry, and the tech companies have to work together to really solve this problem. It's not about just humanity, right? I mean, AI is an integral part of our life. I mean, we call it securing the future of human AIT, where we will work together to fix the problem, to manage energy transition, and secure the energy which is immensely needed both for human as well as for AI to do the transformation. And that is where we are trying to collaborate with all entities in the ecosystem to really bring a change.
Yeah, and I think it's a positive conversation because it's interesting. Jay, we had a panel here yesterday, and actually a couple of panels where it always came back to national security. So we're having these conversations 5 years down the line, and there's something that we definitely miss because the resources necessary to build out on climate tech is, you know, they're finite and they're only, you know, regionally available. So it's something that we need to think about now, so that we don't fall behind from a tech perspective, national security perspective. We also don't want to brain drain, right? Go into other areas that are fostering this innovation.
Yeah, so Lightsmith started the first private investment fund for adaptation and climate resilience because we think that's where you need to start. You need to get investors into the equation to understand this is not just the first part of the transition. So to be on this journey as an investor, you need to go through 3 stages. The first is, when is this going to happen? Climate change maybe 5 or 10 years ago was like, oh, it's a 2,100 fewer polar bears problem. Like, nothing to do with me, remote, not in my backyard. I think we're way beyond that first step now. You know, orange skies over New York, floods, firestorms, climate change is here, it's a today risk. The second piece was, once you know it's a risk, or once you know it's an event, what's the downside? What's going to happen to my house, my community, my company, my stock portfolio, my fixed income portfolio? And so you start looking at the downside. And we're moving through that transition right now to the third stage, which is where is the opportunity? Where's the upside? What does the challenge that we face create a demand for technology, for innovation, for entrepreneurship, for government action, for investor action? Where's the upside? Because every time we face these challenges, we develop new approaches that create value and move society forward, right? We're not just going to build seawalls everywhere or domes over cities or retreat. Progress is going to be driven and growth is going to be driven by technologies that can face a more complicated future. Investors who understand that now will be in the front of what will be a 5 to 15 year at least transition of technology where I think, as Molly said, we're going to be living in a climate economy. We're living in an evolved economy.
Yeah, Molly, it's so interesting. We had the Minister of Environment of Panama on the show yesterday, and you can appreciate this. I had asked him, I'm like, how do you sell this to your constituents? We have more people at the UNGA than we've ever had before, and here we are talking about climate tech and change. Meanwhile, there's more private jets and teams and closed traffic and traffic jams and so forth. And he's like, Jill, you're right. It is hypocritical. We need to be doing these things now. We've talked about it enough. We need to implement this now, which echoes your point. It's too late in 3 to 5 years.
Well, and to answer your previous question, what I am doing tomorrow, we are participating in an investor salon to try to, because spending on adaptation and resilience solutions is a tiny fraction, like a tiny, tiny percentage of overall investment. Even though we have seen investment in decarbonization speed up dramatically, adaptation and resilience solutions are still very much left behind. And so it is both an opportunity and a moral imperative, because the people who experience the effects of climate change soonest are often the ones who are least prepared to deal with it and frankly emitted the least in the first place. And so while we are talking to investors about how this is a huge opportunity, we're not trying to say, come along and profit on this crisis. But the spending has to happen. And so what we're going to do is hold an event to at least start, and that's what GARI and MSCI and Bezos Earth Fund teamed up to try to do, is create this framework for identifying these existing investments, even in the public equity sphere, that you can do right now to start popularizing these solutions, making them profitable, bringing down the cost curve so that everybody can benefit.
Right. So we're familiar with what AiDash does, and it makes sense that you're delivering that data for the industry to move itself forward. Jay, can you help us identify an example of what some of these investments might be? Because we're saying climate tech. Okay, well, what's an example?
Yeah. So so the MSCI Sustainability Institute, is part of the unavoidable opportunity paper that GARI worked on, did an analysis of the 9,000 public companies, and they identified over 800 that you could put in your stock portfolio today that have technologies and solutions that can help us either understand or manage this risk. So what are examples? It's everything from building materials that we're going to need to do to deploy in order to actually rebuild an infrastructure that's going to be more proof against flooding and storms and fires and other kinds of activity. It's healthcare diagnostics, because the complexity of healthcare is going to change. Lightsmith just made an investment in a company called Beep in Brazil, because they do rapid response digital health analysis, vaccination, and diagnostics. And Brazil has now just seen a 5 million case explosion in dengue fever this year alone because of climate, increased populations of mosquitoes all across Latin America from flooding last year. So technologies like that give us a first and second derivative look at how change is happening and how change is going to continue to happen are ones that are actually able to help us manage this crisis. So healthcare analytics, energy analytics, technologies like cooling, technologies like air purification, all these will be accelerated in demand by the need created by climate change.
Very interesting take on how to think of the derivative plays. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from MarketSite and Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.